Let's talk a little bit about some of the other countries such as Germany and the EU who have already implemented net neutrality or similar standards on their networks, and they've actually used this. And I know you kind of briefly touched on this earlier, that in America they're not really talking about it as a way to limit what's on the internet or to stifle free speech, but when the laws are very ambiguous or they're written in very ambiguous language, in other countries they are using it to start saying, well, these sites are causing too much disruption on the internet, or your application, we favor it. We favor your application, so you should get special treatment. Maybe it's a government-style application. And I mean, is there any talk about that from opponents within the FCC that say this could happen if it's left to be very vague? Because I am concerned about that, to be completely honest.
First of all, the EU is taking a wait-and-see approach. They have sort of a fact-gathering proceeding going on right now, and they haven't actually taken a position or proposed rules. But you put your finger on another very good point, which is these terms in the context of these complex 21st century technologies that are changing every day, by the way. They're getting more complex and more wonderful, more powerful. Having to impose these terms, they are vague, and it's going to be up to different countries and jurisdictions within those countries to define what they mean. So the problem is, internationally, this is a big issue, and I wrote an op-ed in yesterday's Wall Street Journal about this, is once you have more government intrusion into this space, you're going to have more government intrusion into this space.
Right.
And regulation only spreads. It's like planting a seed, and then it gets watered, and it's just going to grow into Jack Beanstalk. It never seems to shrink. It only seems to grow and get bigger. So what the real problem globally has been state intervention with internet network management, not private sector mischief. You really can't point to major cases of that. But it's governments intervening in the space and meddling with terms such as regionalness or freedom. China put out this white paper with a chapter entitled "Guaranteeing Citizens' Freedom of Speech" on the internet, and I don't want to have to live by China's definition of freedom.
Yeah, absolutely not. Definitely not. And I guess we'll wrap up here pretty quick, but I've got, I think, one or two more questions I want. For number one, Congress and I believe one of the courts has already said, FCC, cut it out. You guys have no right to meddle in this area. And now there's talk of retitling the internet, bringing it under the Telecommunications Act or phones, rather than leaving it under the internet part where it is, or whatever part it's under right now. That's really going to put some very old rules, and you talked about this in your speech a little bit last night. So just kind of give a brief overview of what you said last night about implementing, 1930 Ma Bell rules on the internet.
Exactly. So back in April, a court struck down the FCC for trying to use one part of the statute, and not to get too technical, what we call Title I. And that's sort of a general authority, but that general authority has to be tied to a specific authority elsewhere in that Act of 1934, which you point out. So
there was no internet in 1934.
I don't think so. Yeah, it was those cranky old phones that were voice only and really scratchy and really expensive and couldn't provide much functionality. So the 1934 Act, so that's Title II, Common Carriage is what it was called. And actually those rules were almost carbon copies of the railroad monopoly regulations from the 1880s. So we're really looking at imposing 19th century regulations on 21st century technologies that are much more complex and completely different. So there's a big concern there. I think that will fail in court ultimately, but you're absolutely right. By last count, I think 301 members of Congress, a large bipartisan majority of Congress has written to the FCC and told them to stop going down this path. Now, for all the people listening, when was the last time you heard the terms large bipartisan majority of Congress that could actually agree on anything? And this is ludicrous. I think the laws do need to be updated, but the statutes absolutely to fit modern technology. But they need to be streamlined, and not. We don't need to be imposing these old smokestack regulations on the internet.
Right. And so, if there's this large bipartisan majority, I mean, is the FCC going to listen to the courts in the majority, or are they? Because to be honest, when you read stuff out on the internet, it looks like they are very determined to get this through one way or the other. They are going to sort of, it's reminding me of the Obama administration, as much as I hate to make that comparison. So do you think they're going to continue to pursue this anyway, even though they're sort of being waved away?
Thus far, they're still pursuing it. Now, there are some talks going on with stakeholders, broadband network operators, as well as application providers like Google or eBay and some others, and consumer groups and such. And there are talks on the Hill, and there are talks at the FCC. So if there can be a framework agreed to that would lead to legislation, some sort of alliance to propose legislation. Does that mean the FCC stops with the Title II, what we call Title II classification, classifying as phone service? That remains to be seen. I think that would have to be part of a deal that all the stakeholders would have to agree to. So there's a chance, to answer your question, there's a chance that we could still avoid this, but I'm, just instinctively, I'm just not that optimistic.
Okay, and I guess finally, is there anything that the general public can do? Besides, do we just keep calling our congressmen and our senators? Is there any other way to influence the FCC? Do we go up there and protest them? What can we do?
Absolutely take advantage of your First Amendment rights if you feel strongly about this, and write your members of Congress, write the FCC. You can go to fcc.gov. There's a blog set up there as well. Broadband.gov, just go to the fcc.gov website and you can find, or you can put your own public comments there. Come visit us, schedule meetings with the commissioners. That's what we're there for. We're paid for by you, the American taxpayers, so come and tell us what you think.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Paulie, do you have anything you want to ask?
I have a question from the chat room, strradio.com. We've got a good team of technical folks. You got Metal Babe here, who's a tech geek. I'm a tech geek myself. I've worked for SBC back in the day before it was AT&T, and I work for a major hosting company, so bandwidth is an issue.
Sure.
There's questions around quality of service, and I'm going to try and get this right. This is from Tom, North Carolina. QoS is a mechanism to set priority for packets so that video or VoIP go first and email fills in the gaps. So quality of service for listeners is dictating what packets go where. But it can also be set to affect a particular source. How do you write a regulation that differentiates between those two, the quality of packets versus the source where they come from?
That person, Tom, in North Carolina, very perceptive question. That's part of the problem. The regulations just can't keep up with technology. This is something, by the way, myself and Commissioner Meredith Atwell-Baker on the FCC, we're both Republicans, and the majority of what we do at the FCC is not partisan. But this one seems to fall on partisan lines, but ironically, because what we're doing is actually defending Clinton-Gore administration policy, which is hands off the internet. So, and they got it right, and you have to give credit where credit is due. It's, I think, virtually impossible for those laws to keep up with technology. And what happens then is competitors in the marketplace will use those ambiguous laws that we were talking about earlier and the litigation component, administrative litigation component, as a competitive weapon, both a sword and a shield. And so you can try to game the system, distort the market by using litigation to slow down your rival. What happens to us a lot of times is it's not that we're picking industry over consumers, like some people want to believe. It's companies will come to us and say, please regulate my rival. My rival's running so much faster than I am. Could you please regulate them? And in this case, one can make the argument that there are application providers out there that are doing just that they're worried that broadband providers might be offering more applications. Now, the ostensible fear is that if they control the pipe and the application, that then they can act in an anti-competitive way, but we just talked about how we can avoid that.
That's exactly right. And also another question I get asked from my non-technical friends, as tech folks, we all become the tech support for our family.
Right.
My PC's down, my network's not working. There's a lot of fear out there about Obama, quote-unquote, shutting down the internet for emergency purposes. And I try to explain to folks, that's technically quite difficult to do when you truly think about that kind of technology involved. So can you address that briefly and maybe talk about what happens if the worst happened, they somehow shut the internet down? You'd be shutting down e-commerce, ATM machines, cell phone networks, etc. So can you address that, the rumors, the myths of taking control and shutting down for emergency purposes?
Right. So the president has an executive order out there from last year that would allow him, in an extreme emergency, to have the government basically take control of the internet. That's kind of the best way to simplify it. You're absolutely right there. From an engineering perspective, how does that work?
I had no idea. You can't just have a switch.
Exactly. There's no on-off switch sitting around for the internet. There's no one, building where it's all resides. That's the beauty of it. It's redundant. It's a plethora of networks that are interconnected, a network of networks. So I'm not sure how that actually would work, but I don't want to find out. Hopefully that'll never happen.
Absolutely. Well, we are here live at Right Online with FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit us. We'd love to